Well, the end is near. The end, of course, of our year-long journey through Revelation. And like any good book, to fully appreciate how a story ends, you want to really reflect on how it began. Not just the story of Revelation, but the whole Genesis to Revelation story of God's relationship with humanity. So today, we are going to, as a warning, do a longer than usual deep dive into our text's backstory, which has its origins in the beginning, when God made the world in a 7-day process of bringing order to the chaos of the cosmos. Genesis describes less God making something out of nothing, and more of God ordering and bringing life to a reality that is described as formless and void or empty. Reality was a wild wasteland, unformed and unfilled. So in the first 3 days of creation, God organizes the unformed chaos into a well-ordered ecosystem, separating night from day, sky from earth, and the sea from the dry land. And then in days 4, 5, and 6, God fills what had been formed with sun, moon, and stars, birds, fish, animals, and the crowning jewel of creation, humanity. And on the 7th day, seeing how good everything was, God rested. Now, some have sought to discredit the Bible's reliability, saying its creation account just doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of science, which it doesn't. I mean, the text just simply isn't trying to compete in that space. It would be like expecting your car manual to explain quantum mechanics. It's just not designed to do that. The best and most recent biblical scholarship suggests that Genesis is actually describing the constructing and commissioning of a cosmic temple. Ancient Near East temples were designed as elevated mountain-like structures, think like the pyramids, with elaborate gardens and decorated with gold and precious gems, and then dedicated in a 7-day ceremony. The whole thing was completed when an idol was placed inside of it, and the deity's presence would rest upon the temple. A careful reading of Genesis reveals Eden not so much as a place you can find on a map, but as an elevated cosmic garden planted somewhere between heaven and earth, with rivers flowing down to water the world below. Its location is not geographical, but theological. It's a place where heaven and earth collide, where God and humanity walk together in intimate friendship. Genesis 2:12 tells us that the gold of that land is pure. Pearls and lapis lazuli are also there. This temple is decorated with gold, the prize of the land, and pearls, the treasure of the sea below, and lapis lazuli, a sky blue gemstone that the ancients believed composed the dome over our heads, that thin blue cosmic layer that separates heaven from earth. Now, this isn't geology, it's theology. And the prophet Ezekiel picks up on this idea later and writes of humanity saying, "Humans were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. We were in Eden, in the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned us, carnelian and chrysolite, and emerald, topaz, onyx, jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and beryl. Our settings and mountings were made of gold. And on the day we were created, they were prepared." Designed as a cosmic mountain garden and decorated with gold, pearls, and precious gemstones, the Eden Temple's construction was completed as God placed an image inside of it, humanity. Now, the Hebrew word translated image here is a common word in the Old Testament, but it's most often translated as idol. And with God's idol in place, God's presence rested within Eden. Rest not meaning so much sleep or slumber, but settling in, resting upon. Now, in this temple, humanity is presented not just as its God's idol, but as its priests, commissioned in Genesis 2:15 to work and keep it. Those words work and keep are the exact 2-word job description later given to Israel's temple priests, defining their sacred responsibilities to work and keep God's holy space, the temple in Jerusalem. But long before there was a temple in Jerusalem, Eden was the cosmic garden temple of God with humanity as its priests. Now, as the story continues, sin infiltrates and corrupts the creation temple. But later, God invites Israel to become a new Eden people, what the Bible describes as a kingdom of priests. Exodus records the dramatic scene in which God formalizes this relationship at another sacred mountain called Mount Sinai in a cosmic wedding ceremony with God as groom and Israel as bride. And just like in the creation account, God speaks 7 times and then invites Moses as a representative to come up and actually pass through the cosmic layer and enter into God's space, where he sees that the floor is made of lapis lazuli, the same sky blue color we see when we look up. You have to kind of use your imagination here, but what Moses sees in God's space, God then gives to him as what God calls a pattern, a blueprint for him to go down and build. The newlyweds are going to move in together. God says, make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. Now, I can't even put together, IKEA instructions. Moses has to build a temple as a replica of heaven, a portable miniature working model of paradise designed to resemble Eden with trees and flowers and images of animals like Eden, with an east-facing entrance just like Eden and 2 cherubs guarding it like Eden, with a 7-branched candelabra meant to resemble the tree of life in Eden. But the most significant and sacred space in the tabernacle was the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, a place where the unfiltered, undiluted presence of God rested. A place where only the priest, only briefly and only once a year, only after a very strict purification ritual, and only while wearing garments decorated with gold, pearls, and those gemstones Ezekiel listed, could enter. The Holy of Holies was where God's space and human space intersected and overlapped, heaven and earth colliding in a sacred singularity. Years ago, I did some work for an Austrian firm that creates content for a large pharmaceutical company. And to celebrate the work we did, the owner flew into Canada and limoed our team and spouses up to the Royal York Hotel in Toronto to experience something called the chef's table. Now, in really fancy restaurants, the chef's table is not exactly in the dining room and it's not exactly in the kitchen. It's an in-between space that's both dining room and kitchen. Now, you don't order. The chef creates the meal, curating every flavor profile and ingredient, every course and pairing, like a culinary tour guide, guiding you through and drawing your attention to every exquisite detail and delicacy. It's them on a plate. Well, the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle was like a spiritual chef's table, a unique shared space where God and priest came together once a year for a curated sacred meal. And this was how God and Israel dwelt together as bride and groom. Now, in time, the portable tabernacle was replaced with a more permanent structure, the temple. But just like Eden, the temple became infiltrated and corrupted by sin as its priests and even the kings of Israel began, among other things, using its temple courtyards as like a royal burial ground, like literally converting its gardens into a graveyard. For this and many other things, God allows Israel to be held captive and conquered by Babylon. And while in exile there, the prophet Ezekiel has a vision where he's transported to a high sacred mountain and he's able to see into the temple where he sees the remaining priests secretly worshiping the serpent. Ezekiel learns of God's plans to allow Babylon to completely destroy the temple, which happens shortly after. But about 20 years later, with the temple destroyed and yet still exiled in Babylon, Ezekiel has another vision where he is again transported to a high mountain space, and he again sees a temple. Only this time, it's not a physical building structure. It's a pattern, like a blueprint. And he's told to measure this pattern. And he learns that its dimensions and symmetrical design are a reflection of God's ordering the chaos of creation, ordering the cosmos, creating a space hospitable for God and humanity to dwell together. The whole vision is just a big reminder of God's ongoing desire for shared space to dwell with us, a place where God's presence shapes everything. Now, eventually the exile in Babylon ended, and Israel went back home and rebuilt the temple. They called it the Second Temple, but it really just wasn't the same. In fact, the priest Ezra tells us that many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple, well, they wept aloud when they saw its construction. The glory was gone, never to return again. Until Jesus. Now, John, who wrote Revelation, which I promise we're going to get to, but in his gospel account of Jesus, John introduces Jesus as the Word of God, God's inner voice and identity dwelling among us. And that word dwelling is actually literally the word tabernacle. John's saying that God tabernacled among us in Jesus. That God's space and our space overlapped in one single person. Fully God, fully human, God with us. The true reality to which the temple pattern had only pointed. And so imagine the high drama as Jesus walks into that second temple and starts redecorating, like flipping over tables. They were furious and they wanted to kill him. But Jesus looked at them and said, "Destroy this temple," speaking of himself, "and I'll raise it up again in 3 days." Which is exactly what happened. They destroyed the temple of his body on the cross, only to see it rebuilt in resurrection glory 3 days later. Only to see Jesus then invite his followers to come and unite with him as his body and bride, the church, a new temple people. Which is exactly how the New Testament authors describe the church, saying things like, "Don't you know that you all are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst?" Describing each of us individually as living stones being built into a temple of the Spirit to be a holy priesthood. It's the Eden ideal, the creation, temple, and priesthood reborn and reimagined in the church. And with this as our background, I now finally invite you to turn in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 21, where we read, starting in verse 9, that an angel said to me, "Come, and I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high. As John describes being carried up to a high mountain space, just like Ezekiel, he's signaling something not geographical, but theological. He's setting our expectation for what's about to come. And in that high sacred space, John is given the chance to get a behind-the-scene glimpse of the bride of Christ. Now, referring to the church as the bride of Christ is actually kind of a PG-13 way of talking about the intimate love that unites Christ and the church, as the two, in the words of Genesis, become one flesh. In fact, the Apostle Paul, when writing about spouses learning to love each other better, can't help but see the connection. And so he writes of spousal intimacy, saying, this is actually a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. It's a profound mystery, a spiritual and physical uniting of heaven and earth as God and humanity and the church come together as one. Now, John turns to see the bride, and what he actually sees then is the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. The holy city is actually like a rare specific term used to refer to Jerusalem as like synonymous with the temple. So to be clear here, John is seeing a bride who is a city that is also a cosmic mountain garden temple. It's a metaphor salad that's meant to pull all of these images together into a single portrait of the church in the final age. And notice John doesn't see the church as, a bunch of individual souls floating up into the clouds to live with God in some eternal disembodied ethereal existence. John sees the church as a body coming down out of heaven from God, like a bride coming down the aisle on their wedding day. Now, maybe like me, you were raised in a faith tradition that sort of celebrated the idea that this world is not my home, I'm only passing through. It's a corrupted version of Christianity that sees this world as bad and evil, a reality from which God is going to deliver us by destroying the world and taking our souls, that invisible, immaterial inner us, up to heaven one day. It's as if in John 3:16, Jesus had said, "For God so loathes the world that if we believe in him, we'll get taken to a better place." But that's not what Jesus said, and that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible presents the world as part of God's good creation. That, yes, having been taken hostage by sin, like infected as with a terminal disease, needs to be liberated and healed, like reborn, not rejected, delivered, not discarded. This world, like all of us, will undergo a kind of death, but in order to be resurrected as a new heaven and earth creation, reality 2.0, fully restored. You see, Jesus didn't die so we could all go to heaven. Jesus rose to bring heaven down to us. And in the end, that's how Jesus saves the world. This world is not a rental. It's not a disposable dumpster fire that we're going to escape one day, like with our noses plugged. Jesus revealed that God so loves the world, teaching us to pray that God's work and will would be done here on earth as it is in heaven, ushering heaven's reality into ours as we co-labor with Christ in the reunification of the cosmos, merging God's space with our space until the whole world becomes one big shared space of sacred love. The Bible's vision for the church is not of religious escapism. It's a full engagement as we are reborn as a people who have a vital role to play in reshaping reality. When we let Jesus shape our values and priorities and choices and lifestyle, we are participating in nothing short of the salvation and redemption of the world. And if you think that's a pretty big vision, well, welcome to church. I mean, just look at the magnitude with which John describes it. John says that the angel had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and its walls, and the city was laid out like a square as long as it was wide. And he measured the city with the rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length and as wide and high as it is long. The world's tallest building is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It rises to a height of over 1/2 mile high. It's an incredible feat of human engineering. But the city John sees here is like 3,000 times taller. That's the distance from like Toronto to Texas. And it's as long and wide as it is high. Historians estimate that its surface area would have covered essentially the then known inhabited world. In other words, John is seeing a city that's a global city that's big enough for everyone. No suburbs or outskirts, no outsiders. But more significant even than its size is its shape. Equal in height, length, and width, it's a perfect cube. And you know what? There's only one other perfect cube-shaped object described in the entire Bible. Can you guess what it was? If you guessed something to do with the temple, your instincts are very good. In 1 Kings, we read, the inner sanctuary of the temple was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and 20 high. The Holy of Holies, that inner room, a perfect cube. That's what all this measuring was about. John is envisioning that through the church, the whole world will one day be filled, saturated with the unfiltered, undiluted, high potency presence of God, just like it was in the Holy of Holies, just like it was in Eden, just as it is in heaven. An eternal chef's table where God's space and our space overlap, not in a cube-shaped room, but everywhere, not just for one person, but for everyone, not just briefly once a year, but every moment. God with us. No curtain, no veil, just bride and groom, intimate and inseparable, one flesh together as a living temple of love. One more little detail about the measuring. Because of the very specific nature of the measurements that are given here in Revelation, it's led some to assume that this must be describing some literal building or some literal object. In fact, some of the translators actually convert the ancient measurements into miles or meters, so modern day readers have a frame of reference. But I think they're obscuring John's point. Because see, a keen reader will recognize we've seen these numbers before in Revelation. 144, 12,000. I mean, previously, these numbers were used to describe the whole redeemed people of God from every nation, tribe, and tongue. And John even adds this curious detail about the angel using a human measurement. A cubit was actually an ancient measure based off of the human body. But it's as if what John is seeing is a temple structure built not out of bricks, but out of bodies, out of human lives, a living temple. Now, having thoroughly explored what forms the temple, John now tells us what fills it, saying, "The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. The foundations were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth ruby, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, turquoise, jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. The 12 gates were 12 pearls, each gate made of a single pearl. And the great street of the city was gold, as pure as transparent glass." It's the gemstones of Eden, right? The glittering prize of earth, sea, and sky, once worn by priests as a reminder of humanity's original glorious glow, now bedazzling the temple foundations. The Apostle Paul tells us that the church is a temple whose foundations are the prophets and apostles' teaching, the old and new covenant messengers of faith. And so John reveals here that written on the foundations are the names of the 12 apostles. And then in each of the 12 gates, which are individual pearls, are inscribed with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the floor of the temple, just like the floor of the ancient temple, is all gold, so pure you can see through it. Gold, pearls, precious gemstones. We are in Eden, the creation temple, reborn as the church. Now, having told us what fills the temple, John finally tells us what is absent from it. He says there's no temple building or structure because Christ and the church, the bride and groom, tabernacle together in pure intimacy. There's no need for a building. There's also no sun or moon, reminding us of the first day of creation when God said, "Let there be light," and the glory of God illuminated the cosmos, even though the sun, moon, and stars weren't created till day 4. Similarly, there's no night because darkness and evil have been extinguished. And with the dark and dread of night gone, there's no need for any security. The gates remain open all the time, ready to receive tributes from the nation's treasures. But best of all, what's not there is sin. John says that we worship God purely. There's no idolatry. That we love each other just as much as we love ourselves, so there are no impure relationships. And with that dragon serpent, the Satan gone and destroyed, there's no deception, no one to lead us away from trusting in God fully. This is John's vision of the church. And I said at the beginning that In order to fully appreciate how a story ends, we've got to reflect on its beginnings. But what I want us to fully appreciate today is that how this story ends, how our story ends, has its beginnings in us, here and now, today. God is already with us, and we are already Christ's bride and body, each of us mini temples. Us together, one glorious temple made from precious stones, each as precious as the next, glowing reflections of the glory and image of God. The Eden temple, reborn and rebuilt in us. You see, the church isn't the building in which we gather for spiritual formation and missional engagement. The church is the community with whom we gather for spiritual formation and missional engagement, together forming a new Holy of Holies, not a cube-shaped room, but a Christ-shaped community. The beginnings of God's full and final vision for the world, to bring heaven down to earth and renew the whole of creation. Friends, we are the means to God's ultimate end, and it's an end that's not just near, it's already here. But if your brand of faith has you just passing through this life, may I gently say it's time to wake up and realize that you were made for more than just somewhere out there, someday beyond the blue. You were made for right here and right now, to be filled and formed by Christ as part of the temple where God's Spirit rests. The real question for us is, what's forming and filling us these days? Are the dimensions of my life ordered like a temple? Are my days designed around communion with God and community with God's people and contributions to the work of justice in the world? Is my life constructed on the foundations not of gold but of grace, decorated not with lapis lazuli but with loyal love even for our enemies? Are we a priceless pearl-like gateway into the kingdom of heaven? Because, church, we've been called to serve as priests, to work and keep the way of Jesus with temple-like devotion, to walk with God in intimate friendship and work with the Spirit in every day, making this space a little more like God's space. Now, how that happens practically? Well, I think it means a few things. First, it means that as we learn to live like temples, we need to foster daily devotion, to create space in our lives to be filled and formed by Christ. And additionally, I think it means participating regularly and actively in the broader temple experience. Not just showing up consistently on Sundays, but contributing to community building and to the missional work of the church. Because thirdly, I think it means remembering that God's main criticism of the old temple was that while they sang and sacrificed and preached and prayed, the poor and powerless went mostly unnoticed and uncared for. That's why here at Southridge, we are seeking to be a temple where spiritual formation and missional engagement go hand in hand, where we are just as concerned about passionate worship as we are about compassionate work. Because at the end of the day, friends, that's the kind of temple that God wants to dwell in. I'm going to invite the band to come up and the communion volunteers to come and get ready to serve us. And as we wrap up our time together today, I want to invite you to the chef's table, to a place where we get to dine on life's ultimate delicacy, the bread of Christ's presence and the cup of God's covenantal love for us. And as we eat and drink these elements together, I pray that we will be filled with the immeasurable love of Christ, filled and formed into God's true temple. Holy Spirit, come.